In the summer of 1915, Galveston Island stood as a monument to human resilience. 15 years had passed since the catastrophic hurricane of 1900 claimed thousands of lives and reduced much of the city to rubble. The island that emerged from that devastation was different. It was fortified, it was raised, and it was confident. The seawall stretched along the Gulf side of the island, a massive concrete barrier 17 feet high and more than 3 miles long. Engineers had poured thousands of cubic yards of concrete to create this bulwark against the sea. Behind it, the entire city had been elevated. Workers had jacked up buildings on stilts while dredging operations pumped sand and fill beneath them, raising the grade of the island as much as 17 feet in some areas. Streets that once sat at sea level now looked down upon the beach. The project had taken years and cost millions of dollars, but by 1915, it seemed complete. Galveston had reclaimed its place as a vital Gulf Coast port. Cotton bales moved through the wharves. Steamships arrived and departed on schedule. The Strand, once called the Wall Street of the South, hummed with commerce. Banks, insurance companies, and merchant houses conducted business in brick buildings that had been lifted and reinforced. The city's population had recovered to roughly 40,000 residents, a mixture of dock workers, merchants, cotton traders, and families who had chosen to stay or return after the Great Storm. The summer of 1915 was typical for the Texas coast. Heat settled over the island like a weight. Humidity made the air thick enough to taste. On calm days, the Gulf lay flat and gray-green beneath a hazy sky. Seabirds wheeled over the fishing piers. Children swam in the surf near the bathhouses along the beach. The smell of salt and fish and creosote from the docks mixed with the scent of oleander blooming in the sand. But confidence had bred a certain complacency. The seawall was there. The grade raising was complete. Galveston had faced the worst the Gulf could deliver and had rebuilt itself into something stronger. Many residents believed the city was now safe from the kind of storm that had devastated it before. Weather forecasting in 1915 was rudimentary by modern standards. The United States Weather Bureau operated a network of observation stations along the coast, but communication was slow and methods were imprecise. Forecasters relied on telegraph reports, barometric pressure readings, and visual observations of cloud formations and wind direction. There were no satellites, no radar, no reconnaissance aircraft to fly into developing storms and measure their strength. A hurricane forming in the open Gulf might not be detected until it was already approaching land. The Weather Bureau office in Galveston was housed in a building that had survived the 1900 storm. Isaac Klein, the Bureau's chief meteorologist during that catastrophe, was no longer stationed on the island, having been transferred after questions arose about his decisions before the Great Storm. But the work continued. New observers tracked conditions and sent daily reports to the central office in Washington. They measured wind speed with anemometers, recorded barometric pressure with mercury barometers, and noted changes in temperature and humidity. When conditions warranted, they issued storm warnings by telegraph to other stations and to the port authorities. In early August 1915, the Gulf was quiet. Fishing boats went out in the morning and returned in the afternoon. Cargo ships moved through the harbor without incident. The heat was relentless, but that was expected. Summer along the Texas coast was always hot. The people of Galveston went about their lives. They worked in the cotton warehouses and the shipping offices. They shopped along the Strand and attended church on Sundays. They trusted the seawall to protect them. They trusted the raised streets and elevated homes to keep them safe. They had no reason to believe that within days the Gulf would rise again. The storm that would strike Galveston in August 1915 began, as most Gulf hurricanes do, far from Texas. Weather systems moved across the Atlantic from the coast of Africa, gathering heat and moisture as they traveled westward. Some dissipated over cooler waters. Others strengthened into tropical storms or hurricanes. The science of tracking these systems was still in its infancy. By the second week of August, observers at various Weather Bureau stations began noting unusual atmospheric conditions. Barometric pressure readings along the Gulf Coast started to fall. The change was gradual at first, barely noticeable on the daily charts, but experienced forecasters understood what a dropping barometer often signaled. Somewhere over the warm waters of the Gulf, a low-pressure system was organizing. On August 15, reports came in from stations in Louisiana and along the western Florida coast. Winds had shifted from their usual southeasterly direction. Clouds were thickening. The air felt heavier than usual, even for August. Ships at sea began sending wireless messages reporting rough conditions and falling pressure. The Weather Bureau issued advisories indicating that a tropical disturbance was likely moving through the Gulf. In Galveston, the signs were subtle at first. The morning of August 16 dawned hot and still. The usual sea breeze failed to develop. The Gulf lay flat and glassy, an unnatural calm that some of the older fishermen recognized. The sky held a peculiar cast, not quite gray but not quite blue either. High cirrus clouds streaked across the upper atmosphere, moving in directions that did not match the surface winds. By midday, the clouds had thickened into an overcast layer. The air grew more oppressive. Those who worked outdoors noticed the change immediately. Stevedores loading cotton onto ships in the harbor paused to wipe sweat from their faces more frequently. The temperature had not risen, but the humidity had increased to the point where breathing felt laborious. Toward evening, the wind began to pick up. It came from the north at first, a reversal of the usual pattern. Then it shifted to the northeast, steady and cool. Sailboats in the harbor swung on their moorings. Flags on the wharves snapped and fluttered. The tide, which should have been receding, held steady and then began to rise. The Weather Bureau office in Galveston received updated reports throughout the day. Stations to the east and south reported sustained winds and heavy rain. The system was moving northwest, tracking toward the Texas coast. By late afternoon on August 16, the Bureau issued storm warnings for the upper Texas coast, including Galveston. The warnings went out by telegraph to other stations, to newspapers, and to the port authorities. But storm warnings in 1915 did not carry the same specificity they would in later decades. There was no classification system for hurricane intensity, no mention of sustained wind speeds or expected storm surge heights. The warnings simply advised that a tropical storm or hurricane was approaching and that precautions should be taken. What those precautions should be was left largely to individual judgment. Some residents took the warning seriously. They shuttered windows and moved valuables to upper floors. They filled bathtubs with fresh water in case the supply was disrupted. Those who had lived through the 1900 storm made quiet preparations, their memories sharp and painful, but many others remained unconcerned. They had the seawall now. The city had been razed. Surely this storm, whatever its strength, could not be as bad as the one 15 years earlier. As night fell on August 16, the wind continued to increase. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. The tide continued to rise, pushing water into the lower streets on the bay side of the island. Small boats broke loose from their moorings and drifted in the harbor. The barometer at the Weather Bureau office continued its steady decline. By midnight, conditions had deteriorated significantly. Wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour. Rain fell in sheets, driven sideways by the gale. The streets on the Gulf side of the island were already flooding, seawater pouring over the top of the seawall in places where the structure met natural gaps in the terrain. The sound of wind and rain drowned out nearly everything else. Galveston was entering the storm. The hurricane made landfall near Galveston in the early morning hours of August 17, 1915. The exact time was difficult to determine. Conditions had been deteriorating for hours, and there was no clear moment when the storm arrived. Instead, it was a gradual intensification of wind and water until the island was fully enveloped. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Sustained winds exceeded 70 miles per hour. Gusts were considerably stronger. The anemometer at the Weather Bureau office recorded wind speeds until the instrument failed, torn from its mounting by the force of the gale. After that, observers could only estimate based on the effects they witnessed. The storm surge was the most immediate threat. Water from the Gulf began to overtop the seawall in multiple locations. The barrier, so carefully constructed and so confidently relied upon, could not hold back the ocean when it rose beyond a certain height. In sections where the seawall was lower or where construction joints had settled, water poured over in torrents. Streets that had been raised above sea level 15 years earlier were now underwater. The flooding was worse on the bay side of the island. Storm surge pushed water into Galveston Bay, and the wind drove it westward toward the city. The wharves and docks disappeared beneath the rising tide. Warehouses filled with cotton and other goods took on water. Ships in the harbor dragged their anchors or broke free entirely, drifting through the streets where they collided with buildings. In the residential districts, water rose steadily. Homes that had been elevated during the grade-raising project found water lapping at their first floors. Those that had not been raised, or that sat in lower-lying areas, were inundated to their eaves. Families retreated to upper stories, listening to the wind tear at their roofs and the water surge against their walls. The sound of the storm was relentless. Wind howled through power lines and around corners of buildings, creating a high-pitched shriek that never stopped. Rain hammered against walls and windows with enough force to crack glass. The deeper, rhythmic roar of the surf could be heard even blocks inland, a reminder that the Gulf was in motion. And beneath it all was the sound of destruction, wood splintering, metal twisting, glass shattering, and the continuous crash of debris being hurled by the wind. The seawall, despite being overtopped, did serve its purpose in one critical respect. It prevented the complete erosion of the island that had occurred in 1900. The barrier absorbed the direct impact of the waves and slowed the inland advance of the storm surge. Buildings on the Gulf side of the island took a beating, but they did not wash away as they had during the earlier storm. The seawall bent, cracked in places, and was damaged, but it held. Power lines came down within the first hours of the storm. The city went dark. Telegraph lines snapped, cutting off communication with the mainland. Telephone service failed. Galveston was isolated, blind in the darkness, its only connection to the outside world severed by wind and water. The rainfall was extraordinary. Estimates would later suggest that more than 12 inches of rain fell during the height of the storm. Combined with the saltwater flooding from the surge, the entire island became a shallow sea. Streets were indistinguishable from yards. Debris floated everywhere. Sections of fencing, pieces of roofing, barrels, crates, parts of boats. The water was filthy with sediment and refuse, churning in the wind. Those who ventured outside during the storm, whether by necessity or poor judgment, found movement nearly impossible. The wind could knock a grown man off his feet. Flying debris turned the air into a field of projectiles. Wooden planks, roof shingles, and broken glass became deadly missiles. More than one person who attempted to reach higher ground or check on neighbors was injured or killed by flying wreckage. The storm's peak intensity lasted several hours. The winds did not slacken until well after dawn on August 17. By mid-morning, the worst had passed. The wind dropped to 40 miles per hour, then 30, then 20. The rain lessened to a steady drizzle. The storm surge began to recede, draining back toward the Gulf and the bay. Galveston emerged from beneath the water, battered and soaked, but intact. When the wind finally died and the water receded, Galveston revealed itself in daylight. The morning of August 17 was gray and cool, the temperature having dropped during the storm. The air smelled of salt and mud and wet wood. Clouds still covered the sky, but they were breaking apart, allowing pale sunlight to filter through in patches. The silence was striking. After hours of relentless noise, the absence of wind and rain felt almost unnatural. People emerged from their homes cautiously, stepping into streets still slick with water and covered in debris. They moved quietly, speaking in low voices, assessing the damage. The seawall stood, though it bore the scars of the storm. In some sections, concrete had cracked. Waves had undermined the foundation in places, causing the wall to settle unevenly. Large chunks of debris were piled against its base, timber, sections of dock, pieces of buildings. But the wall itself had not failed. It had been tested, and while it had not prevented flooding, it had prevented catastrophe. The damage to the city was extensive but uneven. Buildings on the Gulf side of the island had taken the brunt of the storm. Roofs were torn off. Windows were blown out. Wooden structures had shifted on their foundations, leaning at odd angles. Some of the older buildings, those not elevated during the grade raising, had collapsed entirely. But the majority of the structures remained standing. The waterfront was a scene of destruction. Wharves and piers had been torn apart. Cotton warehouses were flooded, their contents ruined. Ships that had been moored in the harbor were scattered. Some had run aground on the beach. Others had been driven into buildings or sunk in the bay. A large freighter sat incongruously in the middle of a street 3 blocks from the water, carried there by the storm surge and left behind when the water receded. The residential districts were flooded and littered with debris, but the homes were largely intact. Water had entered first floors and basements, ruining furniture and belongings, but the raised grade had kept most structures above the worst of the surge. Families began the process of cleaning out their homes, hauling out soaked carpets, waterlogged furniture, and mud-covered possessions. They worked methodically, without complaint, doing what needed to be done. The city's infrastructure had been severely disrupted. Power lines were down throughout the island, and it would be days before electricity was restored. The water supply was contaminated by saltwater intrusion and would need to be flushed and treated. Telephone and telegraph lines were severed, isolating Galveston from the mainland. The railroad bridge connecting the island to the mainland had sustained damage, though it was not destroyed. Repairs would be necessary before train service could resume. There were casualties. The exact number would take days to determine, but it was clear from the outset that people had died. Some had drowned in the flooding. Others had been killed by flying debris or collapsing structures. Compared to the thousands who perished in 1900, the death toll from the 1915 hurricane was relatively small, numbering in the dozens rather than the thousands. But each loss was felt. Families searched for missing members. Bodies were recovered from the water and from damaged buildings. Relief efforts began immediately. Those whose homes were undamaged opened their doors to neighbors who had lost more. Churches and public buildings became shelters. The Red Cross, which had been organizing disaster relief operations since its founding, mobilized resources. Supplies of food, clean water, and medical supplies were sent from Houston and other mainland cities as soon as the railroad bridge was repaired enough to allow passage. The city government organized cleanup crews. Streets needed to be cleared of debris so that wagons and automobiles could pass. Down power lines had to be removed. Standing water needed to be drained to prevent the spread of disease. It was exhausting, dirty work, but it proceeded with a kind of grim efficiency. Galveston had done this before. Within days, a clearer picture of the damage emerged. The storm had caused millions of dollars in property damage. Thousands of buildings had been affected. The port facilities would require extensive repairs, but the city had survived. The seawall, while not perfect, had proven its worth. The grade raising had kept much of the city above the worst flooding. The preparations made after 1900 had saved lives. Newspapers on the mainland carried reports of the hurricane. The Houston Chronicle and the Dallas Morning News ran front-page stories detailing the damage and the relief efforts. But the coverage was restrained, almost matter-of-fact. This was not the apocalyptic event that 1900 had been. Galveston had been hit by a major hurricane and had endured. It was news, but it was not a national tragedy. The hurricane of August 1915 occupies an odd place in the history of Galveston and in the broader history of Gulf Coast hurricanes. It was a significant storm, causing substantial damage and loss of life. By modern classification standards, it was likely a Category 4 hurricane at landfall, with sustained winds exceeding 130 miles per hour. The storm surge reached heights of 12 feet or more in some areas. By any objective measure, it was a major disaster. Yet it is largely forgotten. When people speak of Galveston and hurricanes, they speak of 1900. That storm, which killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people and remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, casts a long shadow. The 1915 hurricane, despite its intensity, could not compete with that legacy. It was overshadowed, relegated to a footnote in the history books. There are reasons for this beyond simple mortality statistics. The 1900 storm struck a city that was unprepared and unprotected. The devastation was total. The loss was incomprehensible. It became a defining moment in the history of disaster response and coastal engineering. The 1915 storm, by contrast, struck a city that had rebuilt and fortified itself. The damage was significant, but it was manageable. The response was swift and organized. There was no sense of helplessness, no collapse of social order. Galveston endured, and that endurance was less dramatic, less memorable than catastrophe. But the 1915 hurricane taught important lessons, particularly to meteorologists and engineers. It demonstrated that even a well-constructed seawall could be overtopped by a sufficiently strong storm surge. It showed that grade raising alone was not enough to protect against all flooding. It proved that hurricane intensity could vary dramatically, and that better methods of forecasting and warning were urgently needed. In the years following the storm, the Weather Bureau expanded its observation network and improved its forecasting methods. The development of radio communication allowed for faster dissemination of warnings. By the 1930s, the Bureau was conducting reconnaissance flights into hurricanes, gathering data on wind speeds and pressure systems. The Saffir-Simpson scale, which classifies hurricanes by intensity, would not be developed until the 1970s, but the groundwork was being laid in the decades before. Galveston rebuilt once again. The seawall was extended and reinforced. Damaged buildings were repaired or demolished. The port facilities were restored. Within a year, the city was functioning normally. Ships returned to the harbor. Cotton moved through the wharves. Life went on. But Galveston never fully regained its status as the preeminent Gulf Coast port. The 1900 storm had already begun that decline, and the 1915 storm reinforced the trend. Shipping companies and insurers looked at the island's vulnerability and made business decisions accordingly. Houston, connected to the Gulf by the newly completed ship channel, began to eclipse Galveston as a commercial center. The island remained an important port and a popular resort, but its golden age had passed. The people who lived through both storms carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Families told stories of the water rising and the wind howling. They spoke of the resilience required to rebuild, not once but twice. They passed those stories down to their children and grandchildren. And while the 1915 storm faded from national memory, it remained alive in the collective memory of the island. Today, Galveston's seawall still stands, extended over the decades to more than 10 miles in length. The island continues to face the threat of hurricanes. Modern forecasting and evacuation procedures have reduced the risk of mass casualties, but the danger remains. The Gulf has not changed. It is still capable of generating storms of devastating power. The 1915 hurricane serves as a reminder that preparation and engineering can reduce risk, but cannot eliminate it. Seawalls can be overtopped. Storms can exceed expectations. The ocean is indifferent to human efforts to contain it. And yet, people continue to build and rebuild along the coast, drawn by the beauty and prosperity that proximity to the sea can bring. Memory is selective. We remember the most dramatic events and forget the others, even when those forgotten events hold valuable lessons. The 1915 hurricane has been overshadowed by the disaster that preceded it, but it was no less real to those who experienced it. The wind still blew, the water still rose, lives were still lost, and in the aftermath, the work of rebuilding still had to be done. Galveston endured. That perhaps is the most important legacy of the 1915 hurricane, not the destruction it caused, but the resilience it revealed. The city had been tested by the worst storm in American history and had rebuilt itself into something stronger. When tested again, it survived. And it continues to survive year after year, storm after storm, a testament to human determination in the face of an unforgiving sea. The Gulf remains, the island remains, and the memory remains even if it is quiet, even if it is overshadowed. The 1915 hurricane is part of the story of Galveston, part of the larger story of the Gulf Coast, and part of the ongoing story of how humans live with the knowledge that nature, at any moment, can rise and reshape everything.